In this episode, we'll do the review wrap-up for the Zoom F4 audio recorder. Now, the Zoom F4 was originally on loan from B&H Photo. I called them and actually told them I'd like to keep it. And let's just do a wrap up here. I can't cover everything. This is an incredibly deep product. There's so much to cover, but let's cover what we can. And if you've got any questions, go ahead and take those down below. Let's actually do the summary up front. So for those of you that don't have a lot of time, just kind of curious, want to know, we'll get that, and then you can take off while the rest of us can go in a lot more detail. Overall, the Zoom F4 is an incredible piece of audio gear for its price. It has very, very nice preamplifiers. It has a lot of dynamic range, plenty of gain. Battery-wise, it works nicely on the internal AA batteries. You can put 8 of them in there, and with 8 eneloop batteries, I was able to get almost 6 hours of battery life. So there are a lot of really great things about this. The build quality is actually quite good for its price, and I would say, in summary, that this is the best recorder in this price range that I have used. Now, for those of you that want to go into a lot more detail, stick around. For those of you that just wanted to get the high level, there you go. Hope that's helpful, and we'll talk to you again another time. Now, in this episode, we're doing something a little different. I've got a dynamic microphone here. There's an Electrovoice RE20. It does not require phantom power. This is the type of microphone that requires quite a lot of gain, and so I wanted you to be able to hear that as well. I would often use this for voiceovers for my corporate work, and obviously not something you would normally use for a narrative type film, but for voiceovers, a very nice choice. Now, if you've not already seen the 2 previous episodes, we had an overview and we had a test of the limiters and timecode features on the F4. I'd encourage you to go back and take a look at those if you're interested in those details. Here, we're not going to talk a lot about those, but just sort of give a summary. Now, first of all, who is this recorder for? I would say it's for no budget and enthusiast and even semi-pro filmmakers who want to up the quality of their audio. They are willing to learn how to use a device like this, and they're also willing, in most cases, to shoot the audio separate from the video and then sync them in post. The audio quality you can get out of a device like this, I think, is significantly better than going straight into most cameras, and even better than a lot of the kind of consumer and even prosumer level recorders that cost less. What are these things that make the Zoom F4 so great? First of all, the low noise preamplifiers are very, very good. They have lots of gain. You can feed up to 75 decibels of gain, which is really good. For reference, just so you're, can kind of put it in the same category, I believe that the Tascam DR60D Mark II tops out in the low to mid 60s in terms of decibels of gain. And if I'm not mistaken, the Zoom H4n, the original humble little H4n, I believe tops out at 47 decibels of gain. So that's why a recorder like the H4n would always struggle with a microphone that requires a lot of gain, like a Rode NTG2, for example, or a dynamic mic, whereas the Tascams generally did a little better because they had more gain available to them, and that gain was relatively clean, even up into probably the upper 50s. Now, what's interesting about these microphone preamplifiers in the Zoom F4, the XLR inputs, is that they have a lot of dynamic range. That's something that we talk about a lot when we talk about cameras, is dynamic range, and the idea there is you can record brights and darker darks and still retain information in there. And the same thing applies to microphones in terms of the quietest parts of anything you're going to record to the loudest parts. So that dynamic range is really helpful, because what that means in practical terms is if you have a microphone that also has a wider dynamic range, then you can record without clipping nearly as often. So that is a great, great thing about the Zoom F4. Now, in that previous episode, we did talk about the limiters, and we pointed out that they are actually digital limiters, which is not ideal. And in fact, what can happen is you can actually clip before the audio gets to the limiter, and therefore the limiters won't necessarily do their main job, which is to save you the grief of actually digitally clipping when the audio gets too loud, and then it goes into this sort of distortion sound. So I don't see that as a deal breaker, however. Even though the F4 has digital limiters, because it has such a wide dynamic range, the risk of clipping, unless you're doing something really extreme, is not all that great. And so I think that the very wide dynamic range really kind of saves this recorder and makes it awesome for most filmmakers that can afford this budget. Also, because the preamplifiers are very low noise in the F4, What that means as well is you can ride your gain down a little bit. So you can, normally when you're setting your gain, you want your talent to be talking and you will change the gain until the peaks hit about -12. Well, on the F4, I think you're safe to go down to maybe more in the -18 range. That gives you more headroom so that if the talent do get loud, you also therefore decrease the chance of clipping. So lots of great things here. And of course, if you want to be really, really safe, there is also the dual channel recording mode on the F4. In some cases, people call that safety track recording. And what that does is you plug one microphone into, say, for example, input 1, then input 1 and 3 both record that same microphone, but you can change the gain on input 3 so it's lower than on input 1. Then if your talent gets really loud, those are actually both recorded to two separate tracks, or sorry, two different channels. And then if they get really loud, the lower gain one is less likely to clip, and therefore you can always use that one instead of the primary track. So I don't use that a whole lot, again, because on the F4, I haven't run into that situation. I'm doing mostly interviews and things of that nature, and while in those sometimes there are laughs and things of that nature, which are quite a bit louder, if I gain stage right so that the peaks are only hitting about -18, setting that's for those of you that are new to audio, setting the input level so that the loudest parts only hit -18 dB. I haven't run into any clipping situations yet, so really, again, very capable here. Now, one note, if you do the dual channel recording, you can only do a total of 2 XLR microphones input at the same time, because when you do that, it's actually using 2 of the preamplifiers, one for the primary track, one for the lower gain track. So it's actually using both preamplifiers. So that's something to note. If you are going to need more than 2 microphones at the same time while you're doing dual channel recording, you probably want to look at the Zoom F8 instead. One thing to just clarify, I don't think it was entirely clear in the first episode that we did. The Zoom F4 does not have an iOS app like the Zoom F8 does. That's one thing you give up for the lower price point. So is that a big problem? Depends on what you're doing. For me, the biggest kind of advantage I saw with that app was metadata entry, being able to enter notes, being able to remotely set the gain level. I didn't find it particularly useful in terms of actual mixing and using the faders while the recording was going on, just because there were some issues with iPads in terms of putting your finger down. As soon as you put your finger down on a fader, it would jump 3 dB, and that would be very noticeable. So I didn't find that particularly helpful. But all of the other features were really quite helpful if you need to do metadata entry. That's mostly going to be helpful for people that are doing longer form pieces where you're doing lots of clips and you need to really kind of manage your audio assets carefully. That's a pretty important feature for those people. And if that's important to you, again, you may want to look at the F8. Also, we mentioned in the overview, Zoom in the manual for the Zoom F4 makes reference to an FRC8 device, a hardware device of some sort that you can actually plug into the USB port on the Zoom F4 and presumably the Zoom F8, which sounds like it is actually a physical control surface. It would have gain controls and faders and would also allow you to plug in a proper physical keyboard to that so you could do your metadata entry there. So I don't think that you necessarily have to go to the F8. I'd like to see what that device looks like once Zoom releases it, which should be here in the next not too distant future, I would assume. But we'll have to come back and take another look at that. Now, the Zoom F4 comes with 4 microphone line level inputs, but you can also input a couple of additional channels if you add one of Zoom's add-on devices that allow you to plug into this proprietary interface and record 2 additional microphones or line levels. In addition to that, the Zoom F4 will also record a stereo mix of all those isolated tracks. So what that means is you can record each of those individual mics separately from each other, plus a stereo mix of all of them, all in one file. What's more is you can route each of these. So, for example, if you are sending output from the F4 to your camera, you can decide which of those isolated channels gets routed to which channel, either the left or the right output, or none of them at all. If you just want to record those internally but only send some of the channels to camera, you can do that as well. Incredible flexibility. We did a noise test with 3 recorders in a couple of different categories. One was a Tascam DR60D Mark II, which I would really consider a consumer level recorder. The F4, which I would consider kind of a prosumer, semi-pro type recorder. And then also with a Sound Devices 633, which is definitely a pro level mixer and recorder. The way we did this is we actually set the gain on each of them to plus 52 decibels of gain, and then recorded without attaching a microphone to the input, just to see what the self noise generated by the recorder came out as. and this is what we found. What you can see here is that the F4 is a significant upgrade over the consumer-level recorders like the Tascam DR60D Mark II. It's not quite in the same league as the sound devices, but again, the sound devices is about 4 to 5 times more expensive. So you're still in a different league there, and there's still different use cases for those very expensive recorders. But the Zoom F4 is unprecedented in this price range. For $650 US, I've never seen one this clean. We talked a little bit about the build quality on the overview, so I'd encourage you to go back and take a closer look at that. But overall, I think at this price range, it's quite good. We also talked about the screen, which is smaller on the F4 than it was on the F8 and some of the other more expensive recorders. And it's an LCD type monitor, so it's a little bit slower in terms of its refresh rate. But I would get over that. It's fine for real world use in my experience over the last 4 weeks. I have no issues with it. I also, as a test, put it out in my freezing garage for 2 hours, literally freezing, 0 degrees Celsius, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Brought it in, turned it on, and the LCD screen worked just as well as it did at normal room temperatures. That being said, Zoom is very clear in their user manual that the F4 is not made for use in extreme temperatures, so I would not expect to use it for extended period of time in sub-zero or sub-freezing temperatures, or anything really above 100 degrees Fahrenheit as well. So it isn't really made for those types of rigors. If you need something like that, you'll probably need to look at more expensive recorders. All that being said, for most of us that are enthusiasts and semi-pros, this is more than sufficient. It's really solidly built. I did an internal battery test, so it's powered by 8 AA batteries. I used 8 eneloop batteries. These are just the standard ones, not the Pro versions. And on that set of batteries with a single shotgun microphone that was being phantom powered by the F4, plus 2 wireless receivers that don't require phantom power, I was able to record for 5 hours and 48 minutes. So that's really impressive. I was surprised by that. I didn't expect it to last quite that long, and I think that's more than sufficient for a lot of us. If you were doing a full production day, you would not need to do more than maybe 1 or 2 battery changes throughout the course of the day, so that's really quite good. I would say, in line with what I've seen Zoom publish on their website on the specs and what you can expect with different types of batteries for different lengths of time with different types of microphones connected, they all look pretty real world to me, so I think you can probably use those as pretty good guidelines. One great feature on the F4 that I really like is that it saves the file periodically. So when you're doing a longer take, it saves the file so that if you lose power on the recorder for some reason, it actually will not lose the entire take. And that is actually a risk on some of the more consumer grade recorders. The way I tested this is with a battery test. It eventually ran out of power, and I found that the file was saved up to less than a minute from the time that I actually lost power. And so the entire take was still good, except for that last probably 15 seconds or so. False takes are supported on the F4. This is a great example. Now, this is not necessarily a big deal for all of us, but let me explain what that does. If, for example, you're on set, you're acting as a sound guy, and for whatever reason, you're getting ready to record a take, you'd already started, recording on the F4, and then for some reason the director says, nope, stop, we're going to do a retake on that, or we're going to redo that take. What you can do is quickly get back to the previous take number. So the file name is actually storing the take number, and you want to be able to keep it in sync with what the camera has. So if for example, the camera hadn't started rolling yet, and you want to go back, that's very easy to do. So that is a great feature that was added in the Zoom F8 after Zoom had gotten feedback from a number of people out in the field, from professionals primarily. And that's a great example of how Zoom seems to be listening very carefully to their customers and integrating changes in fairly, I would say, pretty aggressive updates to their firmware. There is a shortcut button on the Zoom F4, which makes it a little bit easier to get to some of the common functions you use. In terms of timecode, the F4 seems very solid. Go back and have a look at our timecode episode, which we looked at this in pretty good detail. And I think that they really have done a nice job. Again, we did our tests at room temperature, so we're not doing any sort of extreme things. But if you're going to be working in those types of circumstances, it seems to hold on to time very, very nicely. And for those that aren't familiar with timecode, this makes it very easy to sync up your camera footage to your audio footage pretty much automatically. One question I get quite a lot is, can I combine multiple inputs to use a single trim knob or input level knob? And the answer is yes, you can do that. It's flexible enough so you can identify whichever combination of inputs you want to gang together, and then you can control those with one input trim. Now, the knobs on the F4 actually control by default the gain trim, or the input level, as many of us are used to calling it. But you can also switch it over so they become faders. So if you're going to do some real mixing, then you can actually change them to faders and sort of balance out the levels of all of your microphones for the final mix. The Zoom F4 also acts as a very capable audio interface, and I think that's fantastic. At first, I wasn't too excited by that idea, but what I found was it actually came in really handy for me. On my corporate work, I came across a circumstance where I needed to do a screencast, and we needed to be able to record the talent while they were operating their computer, and this was perfect. That's something I cannot do with my Sound Devices 633. It does not act as an audio interface, so it was really nice to have the Zoom F8 on hand to do that, and the Zoom F4 does all of the same things. So it's really nice that way. Now, some will ask, can I use this as my primary audio interface? And the answer, of course, is yes. It needs power, so you will need to plug it into power to do that. It is not powered via USB bus, so that's something very important to keep in mind. Because the Zoom F4 needs 9 to 16 volts DC, and the USB 2 spec, which is what kind of port you have on the Zoom F4, only provides 5 volts, you actually have to power it via its Hiroshi input. So that's important to keep in mind. The only kind of annoyance is if you are going to use it as your primary audio interface, every time you want to use it, you have to turn it on, go into the menus, a couple of levels down, and change it into audio interface mode. So there's a little bit of work involved there, but if you're okay with that, then it's a great audio interface. On the Windows side, it does have ASIO drivers, so it can record all 4, actually 6 inputs. And then on the Apple side, it works with the core audio infrastructure on macOS, so it just plugs in and you can immediately use it to record all 6 channels. You can also drive monitors with this if you have powered monitors, so you can use the line level outputs, feed them to your amplified monitors, and that works great as well. Over the last 4 weeks, I've recorded with the F4 and not had any issues with radio frequency interference from mobile phones or Wi-Fi hotspots or anything else. So I can't say that it's 100% RF immune, but I haven't experienced any problems with my phone right up next to the F4 itself, like we're doing right now, or in heavy Wi-Fi areas or areas with people with lots of mobile phones. It just seems to be constructed well enough that it's rejecting most of that radio frequency. So there is our overview of the Zoom F4. I hope that was helpful for you. Go ahead and leave any questions you have down below. And if you have not already subscribed, make sure you do that. We'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.